Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a YouTube podcast produced by Keat TV. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. A few weeks ago, I had a wonderful conversation with writer and philosopher Bernardo Kastrup, one that touched on a wide variety of topics that broadly centered on a rising sentiment among scientists and educators that the days of reductive materialism are numbered. It's not so much that the brilliant but cantankerous old guard will suddenly see the wisdom in an idealist vision of the universe. Rather, it's a quiet change, he said, with smart people asking good questions and realizing that so many of the lingering mysteries of mind and matter can only be sensibly solved by a new approach. These are fresh thinkers who haven't yet fallen into the same ruts and tar pits that have captured so many brilliant minds for so long. Then I met Christopher Avis, an instructor in physics and astronomy at Camosun College in British Columbia. He is a young science educator, formerly of the materialist mode, who has experienced his own version of Jeffrey Kripal's flip. After taking ketamine as treatment for depression, his worldview was rocked, and he's since fallen into that same rabbit hole that has kept me so busy digging this past year and a half. As a scientist, an educator, and now someone who has experienced what he believes are deeper realms of reality, Avis represents a new stream of thought and energy that may in the near future help lead us all through an intellectual revolution. Don't tell him that, though. How will science react? How will schools adapt, including a staff of teachers who've all been trained under an old paradigm? What's it going to take to flip that switch? These are all questions we're going to examine. Thanks, Chris, for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me on, James. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you were able to make it work. So, we've had a couple of conversations prior to this, and I have a sense of your background, but let's go over that again for the listeners. Talk a little bit about how you came to the realization that things might be deeper than they appear on the surface.
Sure. If it's okay, because of the nature of my flip, it's kind of intermingled with my own personal story and
Sure.
And my academic background as well. I might just rewind it a little bit there.
Yeah, please go for it. Whatever you need to do.
So I grew up kind of in a household where I kind of fell into, I guess, like an atheistic way of thinking and existing almost by default. Grew up with very highly educated parents and kind of fell into a trajectory moving into the sciences and into research, which was on climate modeling, and then found a real passion for teaching. But one of the things I've kind of always had in my life, kind of an ongoing basis, is ongoing kind of chronic depression and anxiety. And especially in recent years, I've kind of come to recognize that at least some of that stemmed from essentially like living life on default mode and not really questioning where I kind of landed. Always kind of felt that, you know, I kind of fell into this very materialistic, atheistic worldview by default, and it's never felt entirely kind of earned. Kind of envied in some ways folks that grew up in a religious environment and then made that choice to flip out of that because that felt like kind of an earned thing. So yeah, that's kind of the background there. And one other piece I should mention that I've always had a kind of interest in the paranormal, particularly UFOs, or as they're now known as UAP, and always kind of kept that somewhat hidden because I felt this kind of shame attached to it, with the stigma attached to the topic. You know, it's kind of an academic taboo to look into that. And I would kind of jokingly say, well, I'm just looking at that stuff to keep my mind open. But there's always been part of me that's been kind of pulled and intrigued by that.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about that, like the materialistic prejudice, I guess, and the sciences coming up? I mean, talk, I guess, about the attitude that you probably encountered among some of your cohorts and stuff in school about this sort of thing. I mean, what would be the typical reaction if you were to talk about UFOs or something that's, you know, non-material in nature? Were the students at least open to it, or was it pretty much blanket, you know, skeptical dismissal?
You know, it's not something that anyone ever really broached overtly.
That's sort of an answer too, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly. And the closest that I can kind of talk about it is this. Like I said, I had a background looking at climate science, and there can be a bit of controversy with that. You know, certainly when I was in grad school, that we were still part of that phase of trying to convince folks that there was a real issue there. And so you'd get in folks kind of like calling in, and they were lumped into a bucket as like sort of crank callers or climate deniers. But within that bucket, you'd often have folks be like, what, next thing you know, you're going to be telling me that there's going to be aliens landing in their backyard. And so there very much is that kind of shove this off the table aspect of that in the sciences there. And just an unwillingness to touch anything that is not really strictly kind of talked about within paradigms. So when I was growing up, I used to kind of parrot the phrase, well, I think there's some questions that you ought to ask science, and there's some questions that you ought to ask religion, and never the twain shall meet. Yeah. And I would certainly revisit that now, but I would also realize that I had completely kind of dismissed the fact that there might be some meaning in that spirituality or the religion piece, which you just simply can't interpret through that scientific paradigm there. Yeah. So that's about as much as I can say to that. And again, like I'm not someone that's been the best at kind of upending the cart, so to speak. So I've never really pushed hard at having some of those challenging conversations, and that's been part of my personal journey, is because I've had that shame piece attached to this interest. And it's part of the reason that I'm actually kind of wanting to come out and talk about this as kind of part of my own personal work to explore this stuff.
Well, yeah, that's interesting too, though. I mean, sort of the subtle pressures that people are under to maintain a certain thought level, even though it's never directly expressed, you kind of just feel that anyway, which I think says something about the institutions. But so, I mean, you got into this journey through ketamine, which I find fascinating as it's becoming more and more available in the States and also apparently in Canada. And it sounds like a really intriguing program that you were a part of. And I want to learn a lot more about that. You sent me some notes, and there was you said it's a program focused on healing through community and use of ketamine and a ceremonial capacity to increase neuroplasticity.
Yeah,
and that sounds fantastic. I mean, I'm someone who's gone through trauma myself. I've had drug addiction issues. I've been through therapy, and I've had, work on myself. I've done work on myself, but ketamine has always intrigued me. I've known several people who've had fantastic experiences with it. Can you talk a little bit about what the program was and how that worked? I'm specifically interested also in the ritualized part of it. I mean, how does that play into the process, and does it make it more effective, do you find?
Yeah, so I've always kind of been intrigued by psychedelics, but had never really felt comfortable enough, like, going down to some kind of black market source and just trusting. Yeah. So I had a counselor.
Hey, buddy. On the street corner.
Yeah. I had a counselor who had their own medicine experiences, and she basically kind of said, have you ever considered this? And at the same time, I was watching documentaries like Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, and I just kind of had this felt sense in my body, which almost feels like a little bit of a premonition of some of this flip, that this was kind of the right thing to do. The way I kind of have described it is as sort of like little light bulbs illuminating, and then kind of realizing that there was almost like a neon sign kind of gradually pointing me towards this. So I reached out to the program, and the program is called Roots to Thrive, and it's a nonprofit medical, let me just get the term right here. It's a nonprofit healthcare practice, which really describes itself as a resilience skill building program. And I'm trying to speak carefully to this because I really want to do justice to the program.
Yeah, no, please. I appreciate
the reason I felt comfortable doing it with this group is they were associated with Vancouver Island University, and they really have taken great care to offer a lot of safety with nurses and counselors and psychologists available as part of the program, as well as energy workers as part of it. And it's really evidence-based. So they have tied in a lot of their initial work with research. And so I felt really safe going into that. This didn't feel like something sketchy or anything like that. Yeah. And the initial hook of it was for me was the science and the evidence-based piece. But if I'm being totally honest, I would say that the program offers a couple of other hooks to it so that people can kind of find the hook that makes the most sense to them. And so if you would read on their website, they'll talk about, the program as being one which is kind of nursing self-compassion, cultivating non-attachment, working on your own kind of inner healing wisdom, all of which on the one hand, to me, sounded a little bit woo, but there was
Mm.
also a part of me that was kind of responding to that even before being formally part of the program, kind of going almost like, gee, I wish I lived in the world where there was some credence to that. And I think that spoke a little bit to my own bias in being dismissive of that.
Yeah.
So you go into the program, and one of their, I would say, philosophies is around the idea that many folks that they see and try to help with suffer what I would call kind of attachment trauma, in the sense that a lot of us are dealing with feeling isolated or invalidated. In my case, coming from childhood, in others' cases, coming from maybe more recent traumas there. And one of their beliefs is that healing through community is incredibly important. And so,
Sure.
in addition to kind of teaching skill building, what they do is they form you up in groups of small communities. And the objective there is to really form a very safe space for folks to be vulnerable, to be able to share what's actually going on, and for folks to basically just focus on the felt sensation in the body and to reflect that back to folks. And they call it compassionate witnessing.
How big
So
are the groups, if you don't mind me asking?
yeah. So the groups typically would consist of two facilitators and about, I want to say, 8 or so participants there.
Okay.
And you would initially do this work by Zoom. It's actually the best use of Zoom I've ever seen to know people, because people were coming
Yeah.
from the province, in some cases all over the country, to do this,
Yeah.
to build that kind of safe space, and then start to get prepared for basically what you'd call it like a medicine journey. You would go up to the site where this was being done. You'd arrive the day of and kind of work on intentions and such with the group. And for someone that never grew up in church, the closest that I can express is it felt like sacred. It felt truly ceremonial. We
Yeah.
we would express our intentions. The idea was to create this really deeply safe space. There was sort of elements that were brought in informed by the First Peoples in the area where we live, and so it really felt kind of also honoring of some of the spirituality in that culture. And so, my real surprise, I was finding I was responding way more to those elements. It was like kind of a piece that I had never experienced growing up. And I think that was part of that kind of that flip. And so you do the ceremony, and then everyone is given their shot of ketamine, and away you go. So
That sounds absolutely amazing. I mean, it sounds like it's a prescription for everything that the modern world is missing in a lot of ways, in terms of community and a safe space. Also, we've lost our love or our taste for ceremony in ways that strengthen folks. Like, we no longer have coming of age ceremonies for kids. There's no more of that kind of sacred social bonding mechanisms anymore. I mean, there are some, but they're not universal, and they're never deep like that, spiritually. They tend to be like, Little League baseball or graduating from high school, sort of civic ceremonies, but not something where you're really, investing yourself, it sounds like. So, I mean, how did you feel during that? And then what was the onset of the medication like? I mean, can you describe what your experience was?
Sure. So, I mean, I just within the ceremonial group, or the small group itself, I felt like just deeply cared for in a way that I can't recall the last time I felt that.
Yeah.
And really kind of the sense of holiness is not quite the right word, but that sacred element there. And with the experience of the drug itself, I mean, the words that if you look at things that folks that talk about OBEs or near-death experiences or things like that, the word that often comes up is ineffable, like literally beyond words. And so I'll try to put it to
Yeah,
words
of
as best I
course.
can,
Yeah.
recognizing that it's challenging. The first reaction when I took the shot is that like I think a lot of folks, I kind of constantly have this chattering inner monologue, and I was worrying about work emails and stuff like that. And that stuff, I'm like, okay, that's great. If this is all it is, that's perfect. And then it's sort of like getting up to the top of a roller coaster, and then you just plummet. And
Yeah.
I was gone. Like it literally felt to me like I was off planet.
Transported out of yourself, out of your body. I mean,
Yeah, I didn't like see myself in like
sure.
almost like astral projecting. It was like I guess my consciousness went elsewhere, and literally like during the experience, I remember having this split second thought like, oh crap, they should have put a stronger warning on this stuff because I think I'm dead now. And
Oh,
I didn't
no.
care. It was
Yeah.
literally like the experience of like my own life right now, having been a dream that I woke up from, and I was in some other space. And
Yeah.
sensations felt completely different. I felt at one point that I was just like a fluid sloshing around. And I just felt this incredible sense of peace and well-being, like every stress that I'd ever had was just gone. And I cannot recall when that's ever happened for me. And in terms of coming out of that and gradually coming back into my body and gradually feeling the sensations realigning, what it was occurring to me was that, wow, that is quite literally what people mean, those that have said, they saw God or they had one of these near-death experiences. There might actually be some truth to it. If it was something like that, then this is not just something that you can wish away as, oh, their brain chemistry was non-functional at that point, or it's a delusion or something. It was literally a felt sense in the body that went beyond the cognitive. And that, I would say, is the kind of the real waking up for me, has been exploring sensations in my body or just kind of gut intuitions, or looking at patterns in life that seem counterintuitive. And it's left me feeling radically more open-minded to things. It doesn't mean that I'm completely credulous of everything, but being willing to just try ideas on, go down rabbit holes I wouldn't have otherwise gone on. And, you referenced Jeffrey Kripal's work, which has been such a touchstone in navigating that. And he talks in Folks That Have the Flip that there is sort of this third way of the flip where rather than completely projecting these paranormal or spiritual experiences, nor embracing them literally, you take them deeply seriously, but you use that as a means to provoke further questioning. And that really feels like what's happened for me. So it's led me deep down this kind of rabbit hole, which we can go into. But one of the other things that's been amazing for me is it's made me even more hungry for community. And I have a lot of community through these Roots to Thrive groups that I continue to maintain. And finding spaces and safe spaces where folks can talk about real things going on, and even just about the nature of the reality we are living in, has been deeply enriching and healing. And it's, quite frankly, some of the highlights of my week. So,
yeah. So you've maintained contact with the group. Is it the same group that you did the treatment with, or is it just a broader group of people within the program?
Yeah. So I maintain contact still with the original group that I did the treatment with. And then they have alumni cohorts where you can kind of go back in and do that. And then we just had some spin-off groups. I have a new spin-off group that's sort of focused on what's basically 3 or 4 men that have kind of come together, and we're kind of treating it as a little bit like a men's mental health group. So we've got 3 or 4 of these kind of in various stages. And it's been wonderful. And it's been amazing how much folks respond to just offers of community. I think there's a deep hunger for that, like for actual genuine community. And I don't mean just like your Facebook or your Twitter friend list.
Well, that's the thing too. I mean, before we move on to your the rabbit hole, which we'll definitely get into, I had a similar experience when I first got off heroin. I was a heroin addict, and I got into recovery, and I didn't realize that I'd never really had an open conversation with other people who were going through the same thing as I had. And going into a 12-step meeting, which sounds cliched and everything else, but to be in a room where a bunch of people were trying to be honest and trying to maintain a level of safety and emotional investment in what you're going through, and also trying to work through their own stuff, is what was intoxicating in an entirely different way and a healthy way. And it kind of became the way that you learned how not to need the drug in order to survive. And I think that is another thing that our society today has like forgotten how to do, or we're focused on other priorities so much that we forget that to just connect with people is such a powerful and profound experience.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. And it's funny, like, I always see these tangents now to old aspects of my previous life. And one of the things that reminds me of, and I don't know if you've ever read it, is this book, a novel called Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. And
I've had it recommended to me too many times. I need to read it. I haven't done it yet. Yeah.
It's a brick of a book, but like one of the premises is it's basically following twin journeys of someone at a private school who's becoming deeply disconnected and falling into drug addiction, with folks in a rehab center, and all of those incredible vulnerable spaces that they get into, and how the folks that are recovering from this are very much more alive and having these real human conversations and experiences. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Well, I find that people who've been through recovery are way more open spiritually.
yeah,
And I mean, whether it's out of desperation, someone once told me that people in recovery have already been to hell, so they don't have to
yeah.
question whether or not it exists. You know what I mean? But yeah, that's all, I think, important stuff that our society is maybe starting to realize is more important, and we can do our own part to help encourage that. Now, you mentioned the balloon shoot downs as part of the
Yeah.
reason why you got into UFOs, but can you give us I mean, what was the first moment where you're like, you mentioned early interest, but where you were like in your modern current position, like, I'm gonna look into that more. That interests me.
Yeah, everyone as a child goes through phases where they have this like passionate interest in something, whether it's dinosaurs or Tonka trucks or whatever, right? And I think I probably hit UFOs. I must have been like 8 or 10 years old. Like I can remember doing like speech contest things about it, and it's always been there. I never quite outgrew it. I don't know whether it was just some hope, some part of me that felt like, wouldn't it be great if life was better than or more than this kind of mundane existence?
Yeah.
So it's always been kind of percolating around in the background. And so I have followed like the ufology field probably for 20, 30 years. And what really reignited it for me was suddenly seeing these shoot downs happen, which is basically like about a year ago now, I guess.
And that's
Just
relatively close to where you are, right? Not to
yeah.
interrupt, I'm sorry, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of them was up in the Yukon, I think, right, or
Yeah.
Alaska there, and that's the one that we still don't know too much about. But that
Yes.
that got me kind of interested, and I started going down the Reddit and Twitter rabbit holes with that, and just really getting an interest fired up on that, and at the same time recognizing that what was coming out as part of the conversation about ufology was this idea of consciousness is perhaps fundamental to the subject. So when I grew up, I kind of look at ufology as having kind of three waves. The first is the kind of nuts and bolts stuff that you were seeing in the 40s and the 50s. The second was the kind of alien abduction wave, which is probably about when I kind of came on board onto the picture, when you had John Mack et al. Kind of coming onto the scene and looking at that, and that
Yeah.
really becoming part of the cultural zeitgeist, which probably added to the stigma of the topic. And then this third piece was, I think it has been integrating stuff that was there earlier in the work of like Jacques Vallée and the John Keel with the the kind of control system hypothesis there, this high strangeness stuff, which is really hard to parse even for a fringe field. The fact that what often gets into the pop culture is the more literal nuts and bolts stuff of it, but there's some stuff that really has elements of spirituality, of things that just do not make sense in a kind of a literal materialistic universe.
Yeah.
So that was going to be exciting to see that. And I remember at that point going down the rabbit hole of consciousness research and reading about that, coming across both Diana Pasulka's American Cosmic and Jeffrey Kripal's The Flip. And those two books did a real number on me.
Yeah.
And then partway through this experience with the community of practice, you had David Grusch coming out, which led very quickly to Ryan Graves and Grusch and David Fravor testifying in front of Congress. And
Yeah.
I felt nauseous, honestly, existentially nauseous for, I think, on and off ever since that point, because what it felt like was like, having this interest in wizards and magic. And then suddenly this owl shows up at the letter to Hogwarts, and it's like, holy crap, is there something here?
Yeah.
And it's only grown since then. And in fact, like I gotten to the point where I find that for my own personal sake, the evidence there in support of there being a truth to this has gotten to the point where I find it extremely hard to refute, with the nail in the coffin, watching, language around crashed materials and biologics and non-human intelligence being inserted into an amendment
Yeah.
that was going through Congress.
And
And then
presented by the Senate Majority Leader. I mean, the whole thing was just a huge moment that just went under the radar. The mainstream media just totally missed it, but it was, I mean, huge what they had crafted and what they had actually said within the document of the UAP Disclosure Act.
completely. And then
Yeah.
to watch that thing be systematically defanged by essentially, I believe I can't remember if it was Congress or the Senate that was doing that by
Congress. It was
basic,
Mike Turner and Mike something else, the two Republicans.
yeah,
Um,
with Turner basically having a hell of a lot of funding from aerospace companies. So it's like it's warning flags are going off all over the place there. And that to me was just like a wow, there is a truth to this. And I think what has made me so passionate about this and why I felt comfortable coming out and talking to you this now was all of that. Also, other really solid academics who I have immense respect for, the aforementioned Jeff Kripal, but also Diana Pasulka and gosh, I'm blanking on his name, James Madden,
James
who
Madden,
who
Michael
is
Zimmerman, who I've had on the
Michael
show.
Zimmerman as well.
Yeah, you yourself. I mean,
But no, I mean
yeah,
those folks are phenomenal, credible academics, far brighter than I am. And to see them putting their going, well, yeah, no, there is a there. And not only that, but it is so different than what is presented in materialism that it's made me incredibly excited to explore all of it. And the most fascinating thing is that it's not even the question around the reality of UFOs or whatever the government's done. It's everything that is connected to it. It's the exploration into philosophy and spirituality and religion and history and just the general meaning of things. And
yeah,
what I kind of realized as well as part of my flip was that we're just living in such a nihilistic age that if you really
yes,
adhere to materialism principles, we're here because of a fluke, because some amino acids came together in the right combination to produce life, which also means that that life can be wiped out, perhaps by our own hand, just as easily.
yeah,
And there is no meaning to this if you're just going through life pushed around by your own whims and through greed and avarice and all of that. This kind of stuff, it's like, as Dr. Madden will say, it's a re-enchantment of the universe. And it
yeah,
comes at a time when we desperately need it, when we desperately need to be brought together, no longer divided, and have a real wake-up call. And so
yeah.
that's why I'm so passionate about it. And that's why I'm so excited about the possibility of there being something to the UAP thing, because it seems like there is a there, and I don't know anything else that I can think of that might wake us up like that.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, your words could have come out of my mouth, what you just said. So I appreciate exactly what you're saying. You're right at the center of it for a couple of reasons. One thing I wanted to ask you about is like being an academic and someone who is credentialed and whatnot. Can you talk a little bit about the risk of coming out with in support of something like this? Not necessarily for yourself, but although that may be the case, but also for other academics. I mean, what can happen to someone who comes out in favor of what the rest of the academic community considers a fringe topic? What can happen to them? What's the, what can they lose, I guess?
I don't know that I'm necessarily the best person to answer this. Maybe you should check in with me in a month or two and we'll see where I'm at. But I think
Yes,
it's,
right.
I mean, I'm gonna throw back at this for a little bit here, just first of all, because I've been kind of systematically outing myself a little bit there. And I'm going to say that there are some positives here as well. And let me try to explain here.
Yeah,
So
please.
I've been used for a number of years to kind of outing myself about the mental health piece because I kind of try to speak to that as part of my teaching with my students as a way of destigmatizing some of this stuff. And
Yeah,
people will start to open up on that, once you give permission to do that. The interesting thing is like I'm really trying to find ways to form communities like what I had with Roots to Thrive on campus to create these kind of safe spaces. And so I've had to talk with some of the folks I've been working with about my experience and about what happened while I was under ketamine. And the fascinating thing to this is, you know, folks will open up about anomalous things once you do that. And
yeah,
oftentimes it's typically around death. Like someone will say, well,
yeah,
I didn't really think there was anything to this, but, my grandfather passed. And then I saw this animal that was his favorite animal appear, and I'd never been able to shake that. And it's funny, as soon as you're willing to throw out that, hey, something weird happened to me, and I could just dismiss it, but I'm going to present it to you as if I think there is some meaning to that. I don't necessarily know what that meaning is, but I think that this was there for a reason.
yeah,
Um, People open up to that. And I think so. I think there is a positive for that. Um,
absolutely.
I
Yeah,
don't know. I will be curious to see. It's interesting how permissions to talk about stigmatized things evolve, because I feel like the mental health thing is already okay to talk about. The spiritual thing, we're starting to get there. I mean, at my campus, we're bringing in an initiative called indigenization to kind of bring back some of these teachings from the First Nations, and there is a huge spiritual component to that, and so that is something that is starting to be taken, or at least not there's permission given, I suppose, to talk about that. The UFO thing is going to be interesting because it is, I think, it's being so stigmatized with disinformation there that I truthfully do not know how that will be received. I think there is, I certainly don't know if I would be having this discussion with you if I was what we call a sessional faculty member, where my contract is renewed term to term, because I think there is that it's maybe a subconscious bias that this person's, maybe not, not really fully there or whatnot.
And then also, I mean, you have the security to know that, I mean, to get rid of you would take more than something like this, right? I mean, is that
I would hope so.
Too simple to say? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you're brave to come forward. I mean, despite the fact that you're not sure what the reaction will be, that speaks to your personal courage in coming forward.
Well, thank you for that. And I mean, I kind of feel like I really do feel like it's sort of now or never. I'm really genuinely concerned about the way the world is going. My parents would talk growing up about living through the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there was just that one domino that could fall and it could end us. But at least that's never gone away. We've gotten used somehow to being under the gun of nuclear weapons. We've also got climate change, massive political divisions, rise of AI, loss of trust in institutions. You spoke a bit about the media and where the mainstream media has been on what should be the probably most significant news story of my lifetime, if not of all time. And then AI. You've got all of these pieces here that are, I think, each one an existential threat. And I think a lot of us feel very impotent. I don't know sometimes how we all keep going. We just must compartmentalize this. And so for me, it's almost like, feels a bit like a moral imperative to come out and talk about this, because I think flips like this, if it's accessible to folks, and psychedelics are one way, meditation, which is something I've taken up, is perhaps another, and I think also just talking to folks that have had experiences is another. And part of me also wonders that if we get folks out, if we have a movement, something like a Me Too movement, where suddenly we realize that anomalous experiences are way more common than we think, and we just don't give voice to them, that might in and of itself be transformative.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful idea, the sort of people to self-identify. And it doesn't have to be, I've seen a UFO or I've been abducted or anything like that. It could just be, I've had an anomalous experience that doesn't fit within the physical explanation that we've all been given about the nature of the universe. And therefore, there may be something more, in my opinion. And I think if people were not afraid to share that much, then having the conversation would become that much more, more comfortable. And you're exactly right with the whole, it comes up around death. When my dad died, I was at my high school class and I knew I had to go home. I didn't know why, but I just suddenly knew I had to go home. I went home, and the minute I walked in the door, the hospital called to tell me that my dad had passed. Just like really strange synchronicities, And that was my first inkling to myself that there's somehow threads connecting people, whether they're, entangled or however you want to explain the physics of it. It's unexplainable at this point, and I think that's part of what makes it so intriguing. The other thing about addressing all of those problems, it's like, what's good about this topic is, like you were mentioning in your notes and elsewhere, that it's not just UFOs. It's like the philosophy, it's values, it's like community, figuring out like all the history of ways of thinking. And it really opens your mind to a whole different approach to how to live and how to value your everyday experiences. I mean, it's like, we can all be mechanical and go to work and worry about our bank account and try to accrue money and acquire physical things and think that it's going to be the next physical thing that's finally going to satisfy our itch to be happy in life. And it never quite gets there. And I sort of think that's the point, to kind of keep us going. We're like Energizer buddies with the capitalist battery stuck on our backs. And this is a way to find satisfaction in the moment, not looking to some undefined future that may or may never may or may not ever materialize, but to try and find satisfaction now. And if it takes UFOs or some other thing to get people back into that kind of mode of thinking, all the better. But I'm also with you that there's absolutely definitely something to this UFO thing, and it's been agonizing to watch the legislation get swatted down, and then this new report comes out. I don't typically cover the topical stuff on the UFO beat, but I mean, that's just nauseating. The Arrow historical report was just a total whitewash. I'd like to think that people on our side will get upset about it, and maybe there'll be a strike back of some sort, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Part of the reason why I also find your story fascinating is because you're a climate scientist, and or at least you were in the past. You don't like to call yourself a scientist because you're not actively. I think that's a modest thing, and I appreciate that about your character. But that is catching a lot of flack from people who are fringy or conspiratorial. There's a lot of people who think that climate science isn't real or it's not man-made. Sorry, my dog decided to make a cameo appearance.
All good.
But so I mean, you've kind of been in a position where you have had to resist some of the conspiratorial nutty thinking that goes on, and that's what people accuse UFO people of. How do you balance that? I mean, it's like I mean, there is a strain of our culture and every culture where, or at least, every modern culture where people get taken up by these ideas that they find on the internet and they get more and more radicalized. Some of them turn to QAnon, some of them turn to, this or that conspiracy theory. But then you find a conspiracy theory that you think is true. And then I can't help but wondering, well, am I turning into one of those folks? And then I do the research and I reassure myself, no, I've got a strong factual basis. But as someone who's been involved in climate science, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm aware of the deep irony of a field which has had such a, there have been so many conspiracy theories around it on both sides of that, and then to say that is true and yet ufology is also true. I can see the dichotomy there. Look, I mean, with the climate science piece, the idea behind the science of it is to put all your data on the table and to really look at the evidence and recognize with that the evidence to actually really convince folks of that. It's another one of these things where, you can't build the entire climate system in a simple little container, and you can, do simple experiments where you can reproduce this in the lab. It's an incredibly complicated system. And so the way that climate science has attempted to address that is to, first of all, transparently put all the data out there and to, build systematic arguments, drawing together disparate pieces of little bits of whiffs of smoke to show the bigger picture and kind of find ways to then communicate that. And it's challenging in the sciences because, in the sciences, there's often a desire to be honest about results, which means putting a degree of uncertainty or being honest about when we are uncertain about results, which can lead to obfuscation or can lead to misinterpretation because we do not come out and communicate forcefully or communicate often in language that lay people can understand. I think that's one of the challenges with academia, that the jargon is a barrier to the field there. But based on my own experience, I didn't see the Illuminati in robes coming in, giving me the paper with the orders of what I was to say there. Everyone that I have met in that field has been good-natured and deeply concerned and passionate about the topic and has been following this evidence-based framework. The thing about the UFO piece there is, there is good evidence once you look at it. Now, it is, we can go through various hypotheses, but there is absolutely something to that. And that's the piece that I think I find convincing. If once you give yourself permission to look at the evidence, it's also abundant. Especially, there's eras around probably the 40s and the 50s when the US had good Freedom of Information Act laws where it kind of comes out and demonstrates that the government took this incredibly seriously and, put together reports to not only investigate it, but also to systematically debunk it.
Yeah.
So to me, there is a very clear evidence trail with that.
Yeah.
With some of the other conspiracy theories, this is where you start to get into a challenge. And I've looked at this one because of my interest, but there is so much noise out there these days that, just from active disinformation, from lies, from folks wanting to shape social narratives and whatnot, that it's impossible to really kind of check. I mean, before we went on the show, I was trying to think about what are other examples where we've had conspiracy theories, and start thinking about, well, we could go down the COVID route. How would I disprove or prove things associated with COVID?
Yeah.
I don't. One individual person does not have the amount of time required to do that digging there. I trust some of the stuff I've done in this field because I've done the digging,
Yeah.
but I think a lot of us increasingly are relying on our friends, and that's where we're in the danger of coming down the disinformation rabbit hole, either manufactured disinformation or folks just repeating things without critically thinking. And frankly, that is where the mainstream media should be doing a job to kind of jump in there and do some of that sorting for us. And it's unfortunate they don't seem to be as reliable as they used to. And certainly on this topic, it's been very illuminating as to what hasn't been covered. Even from like the wackadoodle, can you believe they're talking about UAPs in Congress angle?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as someone who's been in the media in the past, it should be covered. I don't care what approach you take, but this whole issue and everything that's happened with like I said, the Senate Majority Leader putting together the UAP Disclosure Act, and that gets no major coverage in any of the major newspapers. And I'm like, you basically had the most powerful man in the Senate put out a document that states that we have extraterrestrial technology. I mean, and the other language he uses are just so like certain about so many aspects of this that to not cover it, even as a lark, I mean, there was just no coverage at all. And part of the problem, I think, with this conspiracy theory stuff is that we've all kind of got into our informational rabbit holes.
Yep.
Funny, but we've all gotten to our little silos where we listen to who we listen to. We have our Facebook feeds, and that's where we choose to get our information because we tend to agree with it. And if you continue to do that and continue to do that, eventually the information that's coming to you isn't going to be vetted. It's just going to be straight out of, some sewer pipe, and people fall down that rabbit hole. And we did see with COVID how dangerous that can be. So it's like it's kind of a perfect storm to keep the UFO thing under wraps in a way, because it's like people who might be open to it or at least sympathetic to it oftentimes now have their hackles up against anything that sounds vaguely conspiratorial because they don't want to be considered as part of this group that's falling for everything,
Yeah.
And I think that eliminates, like in the United States at least, the left half of the spectrum is going to be quite resistant to this discussion just because of where they are and where we've been over the last 7 years with the Donald Trump administration and all of the, conspiracies that went along with that. And you couple that up with some of the faces who are supportive of the UAP issue, which God bless them. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with them. I mean, in fact, I like we'd had this discussion before. I actually find them likable in a lot of ways, and I tend to agree with their UAP stance. So it's actually allowed me to give people a second chance that I never would have looked at, otherwise before. But some of them also get involved in some of these conspiracies and stuff. It's hard. I don't know how we break through that absent some, and again, you go back to the aliens landing on the White House lawn or some other thing like that. But you actually gave me hope the other day because we were talking and you said that maybe that's not going to be the avenue for the intellectual revolution. It's like, if we somehow prove that it's not a physicalist universe, if we somehow prove some other major pedestal of modern science and society as flawed or fallacious, then might give us permission to start to consider some of these other things. And talking to Bernardo, that reminded me of my conversation with him when he's like, no, this shift is happening. Like, there are more scientists coming up who are actually in the labs who have this idea of what the reality is like, rather than the tired physicalist model.
And the one thing that I wanted to kind of respond to on that was, especially with regard to the conspiratorial thinking and the fact that we are at times feeling like we're literally living on the same planet, but in different worlds, is I think in terms of how to engage this topic, Well, first of all, I think it's significant that this seems to be the one issue in the States that was bipartisan, that
Yeah.
you had Democrats and Republicans on.
Mhm.
But I also recognize that, a lot of the folks in the audience are of a different political inkling than I am. And I think it's important that we find ways to move forward on any of these topics that is inclusive and is not labeling folks as based on their political affiliations, because I think this is partly what has led to such instability. And it's shocking, and it's starting to happen in Canada too, like how much we descend into tribalism. So to me, again, like, if I go back to my experience with roots there, I didn't know anything about folks in my small cohort, what their politics were, what their jobs were, but we were able to come together in that kind of shared space. And I think this is the kind of stuff that can unite us, is looking into these topics and finding that commonality in the shared human experience. So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's like we're transcending the difficult political moment and finding a way to connect that's deeper than that. I mean, my whole life has shifted on that dime in recent months, where I have started to realize that I was excusing vast numbers of people just because of their politics.
Yeah.
And that's not fair. I don't know what life they've led. I don't know what they've heard, what they've seen. And so I am actively trying to figure out ways to connect with people that don't involve whether they have a D or an R next to their name, or whether they're politically correct all the time or not, or whether they're, this or that. It's like take off the labels and try to get at their humanity. And I think that's good for them, but it's especially good for me, and trying to open up and be a more, you know, I don't know, kind person, which I think is important.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the gifts for me in having gone down this particular flip route, is the fact that it's made me very much more open to questioning things, much less dogmatic.
Hmm.
And that includes all aspects of life. It's, okay, where is the evidence for this? Is it possible this is not true? Or, being able to hold ideas without necessarily believing them, and being perhaps less reliant on uh, just as you talked about, like the pipeline of information that we get.
Hmm.
And I think that's helpful, because as you say, like there's always realizing that there are those folks across the aisle that are right on certain things, or that you haven't seen them as humans. And so that's the other bit that I think is really hopeful to me. If we're to make it as a species, it feels like we're trying to thread the needle in a jet while flying at Mach 3, and we're only accelerating there. It's not going to, I don't think, be a technological revolution. It will be, I don't know, dare I say it, like a spiritual revolution. And I think I've thought a lot about, what James Madden has spoken about. And I haven't yet been brave enough to tackle some of the works that he's brought up with Heidegger there about
Yeah.
nihilism and our subservience to the machine and whatnot. And,
Yeah.
that something like this might be, I think what was it Heidegger that said, only a God can save us now, that something like this might be what comes at the end point, where you've lost so much meaning because of, going down these technological rabbit holes,
Yeah.
that this might be the shock to the system that we need. And by all rights, I should be, especially in my old self, like horrendously depressed, and I still struggle with it a bit, but there is that spark in me now that there wasn't there a year ago, that is somewhat hopeful, and I would say desperately hopeful. This is why I love kind of talking about these notions.
Yeah. Now, I'm also interested in your role as an educator. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that, I mean, part of in any society, the educators are the ones who perpetuate the paradigm. I mean, and that's not a
Mhm.
negative thing. That's just how societies are constructed. Kids are socialized through school and even into college and whatnot. How do you, I mean, say that there was some discovery that like threw everything out of whack in terms of the materialist paradigm. How does an institution that has been teaching one thing suddenly change if it's forced to confront a truth that it didn't expect? Can that even realistically happen? Would that be the nail in the coffin of some of these institutions, because to change would be so traumatic?
Well, I mean, if I'm being totally honest, the other reason that things worry me more on a kind of a personal level is, I think potentially that nail is already being hammered into the coffin with the rise of AI. I'll talk a little bit about this, and then I'll come back to addressing like
Yeah,
how we
yeah.
flip there. I mean, Look, my institution, so I'm a curriculum designer as well for my institution, or curriculum assistant with this. There's inertia. There's a lot of inertia. So, for example, if somebody brings together good, solid curriculum to me to bring through our approval system, it takes about a year, assuming that curriculum is solid. And that's a good thing. It's because there's a good quality assurance process
Yeah,
in there.
sure.
But
Yeah.
because of that, I mean, what happened with COVID was astonishing. Like, COVID brought the rise of like online cheating through Chegg, and we're still trying to figure out the Chegg piece. Never mind folks writing essays using Chat GPT. Never mind, I don't know, whatever is going to be
I'm
next.
I'm I'm sorry, Chegg. I don't know what that is.
Oh, Chegg. So Chegg is,
I
well,
know a
careful
ChatGPT, but not
what
Chegg.
careful about how I talk about this so that I don't get either of us in legal trouble. But let's say it's a website which employs tutors that you can use, and you can submit, say, your homework questions for help through that tutoring service.
Oh, okay.
And when we were teaching remotely, students could throw my test questions on there and have a Chegg tutor respond within about 15 minutes with answers, some of which were correct, some of which weren't, but that was a thing, and it's
Yeah,
still a
okay.
thing for homework. So it's changed. It's changed that. And the institution, I mean, there's a lot of inertia. You're talking about like a decade to respond to something like that.
Yeah,
Never mind
okay.
ChatGPT, which produces wholly original work, which is less traceable there.
Yeah.
And like, frankly, like, one of the things I see my students grappling with is what is the point of learning some of this stuff if they can literally feed in, homework questions into ChatGPT, if they can literally put in essay prompts and have a full essay being generated? What's the point of human thought, of doing
I
things?
know.
So
Yeah.
there's
I
this,
consider myself a writer, and
yeah,
ChatGPT, I'm just like, what is going on? Like 5 paragraph essays, they're not that good necessarily, but they'll get better. It won't be
yeah,
that long before they're writing
yeah.
brilliant essays, better than I could ever write. And that's how do we value that, you know?
Yeah. And so, like, I don't even know. Like, I also teach in a high school from time to time. We have a kind of a partnership program there, and I will occasionally have students asking me, like, what's the skill set that I should be really getting up on? And I honestly don't know. Like, I don't even know that I can guess a year ahead, much less 5 years ahead. And then you get your
Yeah.
degree, and then you have to retrain. And there'll be some fields that will always be there, healthcare and the trades and such, but a lot of like traditional human work is going to be gone. So academia needs to change, and it needs to change quickly anyways. How do you respond to something that is ontologically shocking? Well, I mean, we have some disciplines, I think, that help us. And you've done a great job in highlighting with Robert Zimmerman and James Madden, like how philosophy can help us with some of this.
Mhm.
In my own discipline, one of the things I talk a lot about is models, the idea that all models are wrong, some models are useful. So, for example, with physics, if we discovered that if there's some core discovery that indicates that materialism has to go out the window, there is still going to be utility in Newtonian mechanics, right? You're
Sure.
still going to build buildings the same way you always did, and fly aircraft the same way you always did. But we recognize that that's a limited model. It's an approximation to something greater. And so you would bring in, I think, to start with that framework. You could then start to talk a lot about, like, how do we test this new model? How do we think critically and reason about that? And if there is a value to academia, it is in those critical thinking skills, which we need anyways in this post-truth era
Yeah.
to make discernment. And it becomes more about looking at testable hypotheses and reframing problems into kind of information flow things. Like, potentially there's a really exciting era where we can use new technologies to help us think about some of the ramifications of this, but it would have to come in that kind of incremental way. And there's a huge institutional inertia, because for us at a small college, we're partnered to the large institutions, and there's a sort of standard first year curricula across the world, the set of them. So that'll be one thing. I think the other piece is, if there is a clearly demonstrated skills gap that makes use of this, then that'll motivate the creation of new curriculum. So I would say, for example, if you demonstrate that there is a reality to UAP, I could see a surgence of interest in, say, physics or into any of these disciplines that does that. Exactly what form that takes would kind of depend on, what kind of career path that'll turn out to. So we will lag society a bit, but until society figures out what it's doing, which is still don't have the science figured out, we're going to be straggling a little bit. I mean, that's the best I can figure it out. It's something that's on my mind every day, and I don't have an answer just yet.
Well, that's interesting, and that gives me hope. I mean, it doesn't sound like you think there's going to be a sudden arresting of like work. I mean, people are basically going to take it in stride in some way, and there will be an adaptation process where we figure out what programs will work with this new paradigm, what won't, and then also, like you're saying, continuity. I mean, it won't change the fact that we get up out of bed and have to put our pants on and drive our car. So all the normal day-to-day things that we have to do will still have to get accomplished.
Yeah,
Which is, I sometimes forget, I mean, it's like in my mind, it's kind of become a romantic notion almost, where it's like, you're going to wake up one day and the sky is going to be shining and everyone's going to admit that there's this truth and that's going to absolutely change everything. Not so much, probably. I mean, we're all human. There may be some things that change and more gradual changes of an evolution over time, but we're going to wake up the next morning human, just like we were the day before. So I think we're always going to have to struggle with that.
And don't forget that we've already had revolutions in science. Like this would be potentially a bigger revolution, encompassing perhaps the humanities and the sciences. But quantum physics is radically different than classical mechanics, and yet most of what I still teach is classical mechanics. It still works.
Well,
so you have both, and
Yeah, well, and that's also interesting because a lot of people haven't fully accepted quantum mechanics. I mean, they're still struggling with some of the core notions because there's some weirdness there that they can't accept, which we may get up in the same situation where we get into a process of confirming whether or not that's true. That could go on for 100 years as people, battle it back and forth. So hopefully that's all something that we get to experience, because I'd really like to think that's, we're on the right science track before I check out.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, there's that quote, like, "May you live in interesting times," right? Which some have said is meant to be a blessing. Others say it a curse. We are most definitely living in interesting times, and I share that hope that we'll be able to experience some of that.
Yeah, we'll see. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Last question I had for you. I mean, we have an hour. We've had an hour, and I'll give you a chance to throw out anything that I may have forgot to ask about. But what do you think about what Canada's doing on this subject? I mean, I haven't followed it as closely. I know there have been some developments. Have you seen anything go on, or is there a resurgence of the subject that you've noticed within, people around you in your community, or is it largely, to your mind, an American obsession at this point?
I mean, this is one of the big questions. I mean, so Canada, supposedly our government is issuing its own report. Hopefully it will be higher quality than the Arrow report. I believe that's coming out towards the end of the summer. We've had a few of our own politicians gingerly express an interest in that, but there doesn't seem to be too much movement on the political front here. It's always a curiosity to me that this subject is so US focused, even once you have, international citizens weighing in on Reddit and Twitter there. I don't know whether that's still because the US is viewed as the de facto leader on geopolitics on a lot of things. You hear this, well, why doesn't China or Russia disclose? I don't know. It's interesting, but certainly from my own perspective, all of the news in the past year has come out predominantly from the States. And for anyone listening, if I managed to switch anyone on the podcast and has heard me ranting on about this topic of late, it's astonishing how much news is coming out on this. This is a decade's worth of news, if not more, that's happened in a year, and it's moving very, very quickly. And there's
a lot of momentum. And I mean, one thing that was interesting to see with this report is that there were comments made by people like Lou Elizondo and others where it's like, this year is going to be huge, buckle up. This isn't the end of this discussion. So we're kind of all on tenterhooks, waiting to see what drops next. Two things I'm really waiting for, of course, are Lou's book, which I think is going to be huge. And I'd love to get a chance to talk to him, but I think that may go furthest in sort of laying out there at least some of the verifiable stuff that if we can ever get that information released, it could be substantiated. And then Grusch has an op-ed that's in the works, but apparently Dopser has a hold of it. So the editing, whatever you call it, the people who black
Yeah.
out the documents when they don't want secrets revealed, those guys. Yeah. Well, that's pretty much all I had for you. Is there anything that I forgot to ask about that you'd like to throw out there, or?
No, I mean, the only thing I was going to say is that, you were asking a bit about academia and how it can respond. One of the things that occurred to me is that, they're speaking of this field and just the broader field of esotericism or the supernatural, the paranormal is there is a ton of really interesting content being generated. And you are really one of the folks leading the way in that. You bring in
Thank
really
you.
interesting guests. And I think like, speaking of someone that has one foot in academia and one foot outside of this, this is like super exciting, intellectual, but accessible discussion. And especially seeing you push the boundaries with having someone like James Madden in, and who's the fellow you had in? He was chatting with that wrote Initiated.
Matthew Roberts, yes.
Yeah, no, that was a great discussion, and I
Yeah.
was really heartened by seeing that kind of engagement between an experiencer and someone from academia, and yourself, who's kind of coming at this from the journalism and hobbyist kind of angle there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a super exciting time to have this, and if I wish I could have discussions like this about, what is this all about more with people. I'm starting to have it gingerly with folks, but it's even, speaking of risk, I may not be at risk academically, but there is still that risk in your own personal life of like
Yeah.
just outing yourself to your friends as someone that's willing to entertain that stuff. But when you have that, when you find that spark with somebody that's keen to talk about it, you have these great wide-ranging, fascinating conversations. So
Yeah.
appreciate you, giving me the opportunity to come and chat.
Well, no, thank you, and we'll have you back on the show soon,
Yeah,
hopefully. It's interesting. One of the reasons why, I read Diana Pasulka's American Cosmic, and that was the book you mentioned, Permissions. That was like, okay, there are brilliant people in the world who are totally convinced this is true. That gave me permission to engage with it, right? And then it just starts to cascade, and you see more and more things and read more and more books. And the level of thought in some of this work is just astounding. But because it's a fringe topic, it's like on limited issue imprints for books, or self-published books or whatever else. And so you never get the signal from the broader, civilization that this is okay to look at. But there really is brilliant stuff out there, and I think it's cool that a topic like this is finally getting some of the attention it deserves, so that some of those exciting thinkers can get some of the attention that they deserve.
absolutely.
All right, man. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
it's
All
been a
right.
pleasure.